All right. Well, this is my second video in a series of videos responding to Mike Winger's 13-hour extravaganza in which he talks about issues of women ministry and women in the home. By the way, I see those as two distinct issues. The one issue is the question of women in ministry. Can women be senior pastors, lead pastors? Can women be the Pope? You know, if the Roman Catholic Church allowed it, would it be biblically allowed for a woman to be the Pope? To me, I actually feel like the answer to that question is very easy. It's yes. I mean, we have Deborah. I mean, we'll get to all those examples and texts. There's only one text that sounds like it might go against that. 1 Timothy 2, and I will get there. But once you realize that it's talking about wives and husbands, then even there it's not about women in leadership. So I don't personally think there's any biblical text that, when properly interpreted, has anything to do with the question of women in ministry. That's a slam dunk to me. The more difficult issue is the question of, is there a hierarchy in the home? And this is the question of complementarianism and egalitarianism. And there are several biblical passages that talk about the husband being the head and so forth, and wives submitting and so forth. And I'm not going to dodge the meaning of those texts. I'm not going to dodge it. But what I am going to suggest, as we'll get there eventually, is that you have to look at who that's being talked to. Who is that being told to? And it's being told to people who lived in a very patriarchal context, and that there's nothing actually specifically Christian about that. And so what we have to ask in context, this is what I'm going to argue eventually, what we have to ask in context is, what is God doing with them in their context? The question is not, put the verse in a bubble, and that's what I think Mike Winger does. He takes verses, he puts them, on the wall, and he says, what does the grammar say this means? Well, that's a very, I'm going to call that at the end of this video, flatland. That's a flatlander approach to the Bible. That if you really want to understand what the Bible actually meant, you have to read it in the light of its context, in the light of its culture. And the question there is not so much what it says, but what it's doing in the world in which it is. That's a deeper argument. And the reason why complementarianism is so popular right now is because going deeper it's scary, and it's also dangerous. And so I get it. But because I think it's important, it's not just a theological argument. We're dealing with real people here. And so we want to get it right in terms of what God actually thinks. But I'm going to back up from that. You'll get a flavor for my approach as we go through these videos. And I want to start with now Winger's second video. And I'm going to do 3 videos in relation to Winger's second video. His second video is like an hour and a half long. This won't be that long. May it not be. But so this is video 2.1. It's his second video. His second video deals with Genesis 1 through 3. And this is, I'm going to divide it up into 3 videos. I kind of wish he had, although, man, he's got lots of videos. But it's going to be part 1, Genesis 1, part 2, Genesis 2, and part 3, Genesis 3. So this is the first of those 3 videos, Genesis 1 and co-dominion. Now, what we'll find is that I pretty much agree with Winger's interpretation of Genesis 1, 26 and 27. And so we don't have a lot of debate here. Winger, by the way, distinguishes himself as a complementarian from the old patriarchy. In patriarchal contexts, women are not only subordinate to men, but they are less valuable than men. They are inferior to men. They are often considered dumb. That in the old patriarchalism. Complementarianism, which rose like in the early 1980s with Wayne Grudem and that crowd, was an attempt to say, no. Women are, both men and women are created in the image of God. Both men and women have dominion over the creation. And so they are equal in value, but they have different roles. So this is kind of, it reminds me of the old slavery, or post-slavery, Plessy versus Ferguson. They're separate but equal. They're equal but separate. And they really weren't equal at all, were they? They were just separate. And so complementarianism, I tend to think, is a passable version of patriarchy. It backs off and says, "Oh, patriarchy sounds awful. Sounds very unchristian." And so we're going to come up with something that's it pulls in the right direction. You know, they're equal in value. They just have different roles. And I believe that there are families where they pull that off. I suspect that my family growing up, my dad and mom, we never talked about my father being the head of the home. I mean, that just wasn't even something we ever talked about. But you know, if you were to look at my father and mother's relationship, they had a basically complementarian relationship. He made most of the decisions. He did the checkbook, you know, and all that kind of thing. But she was a full participant. In fact, quite often, most of the time, he would do what she wanted, even when he didn't want to. So she, by deferment, ran the home in that sense, even though he made most of the key decisions. And so it is possible, certainly, to have a complementarian family that is loving and where there's equal value. That is absolutely possible. Is it the ideal? That's what that's why I'm doing these videos, to respond to, because there's a real movement of complementarianism right now. And they would accuse egalitarians like me as succumbing to culture. And what I'm going to argue is it's actually them who are not only succumbing to culture of the past, but also they are considering the cultural dimensions of the New Testament to be the eternal ones. And we don't want to do that, right? We want to make sure that we find the eternal principles in Scripture, not the parts of Scripture that are incarnated in culture. We don't want to apply the cultural parts of the Bible to all times. We want to apply the eternal parts of the Bible to all times. Okay, well, that's plenty of a preface, and half of you have already left the video by now. Well, I brought up interlinearbible.org, Bible Hub, so that you can kind of see the structure of the Hebrew of Genesis 1:26. Let's go ahead. So, Vayomer Elohim, and God said, let us make Adam. This is Adam. I don't know if you can see my cursor. I don't think you can. I haven't quite figured out my new Mac. Anyway, not important. Adam is not male. And Mike Winger, good on you, mate. Mike Winger's quite right. Adam here doesn't mean he created male. It is Adam as in human. And God said, let us make human. Let us make humanity. That's the generic sense here. Let us make humanity in our image, according to our likeness, second line. And let them rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over the livestock. And then third line, and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps, every creeping thing creeping upon the land. So that's Genesis 1:6. I won't get off into who the us is here. Of course, we Christians tend to think of it as the Trinity, but since Moses and the ancient Israelites didn't know anything about the Trinity, probably there's some other option. Is it the plural of majesty? Well, Hebrew doesn't really have that. See Psalm 82. Okay, now, oh shoot, I've got a little box there in the way. But let me go ahead and I'm going to go with it. So God created human in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Now, him there is gendered him. It's grammatical him. It's not male him. Because here it says male and female, he created them. So you can see the general human. God creates humanity. In the image of God, he created humanity, and male and female, he created humanity. So Winger's interpretation of these two verses is spot on. He's right on the Hebrew. This is not. Who was it? Mark Driscoll, who I don't think knows Hebrew. He took the "let us make male in our own image." That's a misinterpretation. It's a misunderstanding of the Hebrew. And so, good on you, mate, with Winger in his interpretation. Just to quickly give you a summary again of what is his interpretation of Genesis 1. Both Adam and Eve are made in the image of God. Check. That's good on you, mate. They are equal in value here. Check. Both have dominion over the creation. And I enjoyed this part of Winger's video. He's basically saying that that both of them are given dominion. So So a woman is not subordinate to a tree. Well, I'm so glad you saw that. A woman is not subordinate to a cow. A woman is not subordinate to a chicken. Oh wow, I'm so glad Mike cleared that up for us. No, I mean I get what he's doing here. What he's saying is that there may be some extreme patriarchalists out there who actually don't they don't give women the position that they actually have within God's creation. Now there are Winger, I think, if I've heard right, Winger is going to go on to say that women can take any secular job they want. I think he's going to argue that, and he's going to use this, I think, Genesis 1 here a little bit, because women have dominion too. So I'm glad he does all that. Watch the video. Watch this part of the video. Watch the first half hour of this video. I like it. Now, he does do a little side visit to Titus 2:5. I grew up on the King James, and the King James here says that a virtuous woman is a keeper at home. I actually heard a sermon, ironically, by a woman minister, pointing out the "at" in the King James, keepers at home. And the question that the preacher posed to the congregation was, in an ideal world, would the woman be at home? Now, I think I was in seminary or college. I think I was in seminary when I heard this sermon preached, and I had a little bit of Greek by then. And there is no "at" in the Greek. It's one word. It's kind of like workers of the home is the sense of it. And again, Mike does a fair job here of saying this is not insisting she can't come out, stay inside. I mean, that's not what it's saying. Of course, Titus, I would argue, is again addressing incarnational revelation is when God God meets us where we're at and moves us from there. I mean, if God spoke angel speak, if he spoke heavenly language to me, I wouldn't understand it because I don't speak heavenly language. So for God wants to be understood, right? So he meets us where we're at. He communicates to us. He finds images and language that we can grasp, analogies, and then he moves us on. And that's the way revelation works. Every word of the Bible is cultural in the sense that God spoke it to people at a particular time and place and culture. And so there are lots of images in the Bible. Let me give you an example. Do you remember the story where Jacob makes a deal with his father-in-law that all of the speckled animals, all the ones that are blemished, all the ones that have spots and stuff, all of them he gets to take, and then Laban can keep all the pure ones. So what Jacob does is he takes these rods, or I picture him taking sticks, and he kind of takes the bark off in stripes. He puts these speckled rods in front of the livestock when they're mating. And lo and behold, they have mostly speckled offspring. Now, having studied a little bit of biology, if you've studied a little bit of genetics, this doesn't work, but genetically. Just because, if I were to take a piece of paper and put dots on it and put it in front of my dog, at a particular time in their life cycle, I'm not going to have puppies with spots. It just doesn't work that way, And so, let's take this text at its word. You have to picture God kind of going like, this isn't how it works, Jacob, but I'm going to meet you where you are. And I'm going to make these livestock have speckled offsprings, even though that's not how it works. That's not how the science works. Don't go writing a science textbook of genetics based upon what Jacob does here. It's God meeting Jacob where he's at and moving him from there. I've come to believe that God is very practical. If God tried to straighten us out on everything we had wrong, we'd all agree with each other, but we don't agree with each other on anything. So basically, revelation is God meeting us where we are in our worldviews, in our paradigms, in our cultural assumptions, and then he moves us from there. And so, absolutely, what was a virtuous woman in the first century? She ran the house. She was actually, read Psalm Proverbs 31. She ran the house. She's like the manager of the house in that world. Does that mean that that's the ideal for today? Well, it might be in some places. It might be in some families, but it is not, just because that was the virtuous woman in the late first century doesn't necessarily mean that that's the particular form that it should take in every time and place. And my main point was "at" is not actually there in the Greek. It's just not there. It's part of a translation. So here's what I'm going to argue. I'm going to argue that most of the people who are debating this issue, I'm going to argue that most of them live in what I'm going to call flatland. And by that, I mean in a two-dimensional view of the Bible. What's the third dimension? History. What's the third dimension? Culture. Because things don't mean the same thing in every culture. There are several passages in the law that are just kind of very puzzling. Don't boil a baby goat in its mother's milk. What is that about? I assume it probably had something to do with some pagan temple practice, that there was some practice of the Canaanites in the ancient world or some other god in the ancient world, and that basically Leviticus is saying, I think it's Leviticus, could be Exodus, is saying, don't do this because it makes you look like these other religions. But it's the meaning of it is, I mean, if anybody tells you, well, I know what this means, well, they don't. We don't have the evidence to know what it means. I can tell you how modern Jews take it by they don't eat milk and meat in the same meal. I went to Old Jerusalem a few years ago, and there was a couple that was engaged. One wanted some pizza, and the other wanted a gyro. And so she got some pizza, and he brought a gyro into the pizza restaurant, and they shoot him out as quick as possible. Why? Because meat, gyro, and cheese, which is dairy, milk, on the pizza. By the way, you can't have a pepperoni pizza in Old Jerusalem because you're mixing meat and milk. And you might say, well, what? Why? Well, because you don't boil a baby goat in its mother's milk. I guarantee you that is not what that text meant. So understanding the history, the reasons, and I sometimes say doing what they did isn't doing what they did if it doesn't have the same meaning. Like greeting the brothers with a holy kiss. Not going to have the same meaning in my church if I go up and do that to somebody. I'm not going to do it. Read my lips. Wouldn't be prudent at this juncture. I'm not going to do it. So we have to know the why. And so if you read the Bible as a single text from Genesis to Revelation, which I'm going to say is basically how Mike reads the Bible, with it written to me rather than what it actually says. It says it was written to them. Hear, O Israel, to the Romans, to the Corinthians, to the Philippians. It says it was written to them. Well, they didn't view the world the way I do. And for God to speak to them, he's going to speak to them in their way, in their context, in their language, in their culture. Not going to speak in my way. How selfish and narcissistic to think that it's all about me. It's all about me. The Bible's all about me. And so the result is that the Bible tends to have a monotone meaning. Well, this isn't as important in this video, but I'm going to have to go deep, I'm afraid, when we get to Genesis 2. Because when you have a flatland interpretation of Genesis 2, it's like, well, of course, Mike's right. And so I'm gonna give it my shot to talk depth. And some of you are going to say, no, that's dangerous, Ken, or that's heresy, Ken. But I think it's right. The depth perception in Genesis 2. That will be our next video.